Welcome, everybody. I think we'll get started. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here today. My name is Tim Barbado, President of Teamsters Local 118, Second Vice President of the Rochester Labor Council. Very good. Thank you. I'm going to be introducing a very close friend of mine, a mentor, somebody who really helped guide my way through this labor movement. Richard Lipsitz is the President Emeritus of the Western New York Labor Federation, worked for the Teamsters for a lot of years. Certainly has helped me in my career. So let's give a hand for Richard.
You're here. Thank you, Tim. Well, it's really nice to be here this evening. Let's see, how can I start? 18 months ago, we did a program similar to this with Bill. It was at the Workers United Hall. And it was for discussions on the subject of the right-wing assault on the working conditions, living standards, and overall conditions of the American people, working class and the American people. This was before the following took place. Project 2025 became revealed, Trump's election victory, Doge, the erosion of civil liberties, the attack on the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, the wholesale attack on immigrant workers, the militarization of our cities, the revelations about Epstein, or the renewal of the revelations about Epstein, the aggressive military actions in the Caribbean, in now South America, and I guess there was one the other day to see in China, the open support by the American administration for Putin and Netanyahu, open way more than anything we've seen before, not way more, but more. The government shutdown, the looming recession, which is becoming clearer and clearer every day. And just yesterday, the physical destruction of part of the White House. I could go on. There's actually way more. We also, this met 18 months ago before there were 4 major demonstrations in the United States and around the globe signifying real resistance to this program. I'm not in favor of either false optimism nor gloom and doom. Instead, I think we need a real, strategic, united front of the American people to stop this. And I think we can do it. Bill Fletcher, dear friend of our labor movement, mine personally, gave us plenty to consider in May of 2024, and has since spearheaded the Standing for Democracy as an ideological and educative center of resistance to Trumpian fascism. The local organizing committees for Standing for Democracy, both in Buffalo and Rochester, brought him in this yesterday in Buffalo and today in Rochester. And before I say one more thing about him, I'm going to tell you that he's not just a labor activist, a brilliant historian, a theoretician of our movement, and a fighter for the international movement of the working class. He's also a very accomplished author, and not just nonfiction, but also fiction. And there are a few of his books left, and if you're interested, they're on the back table. On the back table.
For sale.
For sale, yes, for sale. I understand. I could give them away. It won't hurt me at all. Except maybe with relations with Bill. Anyhow, that's what I wanted to say. So I'd like us all to welcome Bill, and he's going to speak for a while, and then we'll have a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
I want to thank the Genesee Valley Area Labor Federation, NYSET, the Rochester Standing for Democracy Committee, Colin, Tim, and Richard for making this possible. And I'm really glad to be here. I spoke last night, as Richard mentioned, in Buffalo, and I'm going to cover much of what I covered last night. And let me begin by saying that my presentation is not a rah-rah sis boom bah. It's not to make you feel good. As I said last night, when my presentation is over, it's more, the atmosphere I want more is pilots man your planes. We're at war. And as Steve Bannon apparently made clear today earlier, they intend for a third term Trump regardless. So this is really important because there's too many of us that are acting as if we're facing a slight problem and that essentially things will be able to recover and will be able to return to normality. And it's not going to happen. And that's where I want to start. The basic theme here is that there is no return to normality. That what has been done in the last several months on top of what's happened before that has disassembled the society that we knew. So we're now on the task of preventing barbarism and introducing a new society. And that's pretty scary, but also really exciting. We have this amazing opportunity. But in order to get there, we have to change the way we think. And I want to explain what I mean by that. In 2024, there were many people that said it didn't matter who won the election. I was roasted by people when I said, no, I'm going to support Biden and then later Harris. And that didn't mean that I was giving them total support. I was vehemently in opposition to them, for example, on Gaza. But I said, when you look at the platform that Trump was running on, it was clear that they were talking about introducing something new. But there were many friends of mine that refused, and they said, no, it won't make any difference. And there were other people that weren't friends that were saying the same thing. And I don't hear them saying much anymore. I think that they, maybe they've disconnected their phone or they, decided that it's time to move to the Bahamas or something. But I do not hear anything from them. The last thing I heard from someone who really was roasting me was shortly after the inauguration. And there was, it was when the ICE started the process of picking up immigrants. And this person said, well, Bill, the Democrats would have liked to have done this too, but now they can sit back and smile and let the Republicans do this. And at that point, I realized that this was one of those Twilight Zone moments. This was someone who was completely out of touch with reality, and that there was no point anymore in discussing it. They were just in a different space. Now, when Trump was elected in November, what struck me was the level of paralysis that immediately set in. It wasn't slow acting, it was almost immediate. Paralysis. And this strange silence, the silence of a graveyard that seemed to be sweeping around the country. And so I had an opportunity of speaking on a few occasions, and people would say, well, what do you expect to happen now? And I said, on January 20th, Operation Barbarossa will begin. Now, I don't know how many of you are in your history. Operation Barbarossa was the German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. Now, I want to explain a little bit about this because I'm a lover of history, but this actually has great relevance. The Soviet leadership in 1941 had been led to believe that the pact that they had with Hitler was going to last. Soviet intelligence was telling Stalin for months that the Germans were going to attack, and that they were going to attack in either April or May of 1941. Had they attacked in April, they might have actually won. Thanks to the Greeks, which I can explain later, they didn't attack until June. But Stalin continued to deny that an attack would happen. Much like many of our leaders denied that anything serious would happen once Trump was elected. It would just be a repeat of what we saw in 2017. So when the Germans attacked, Stalin was so freaked out, he disappeared for 10 days. No one could literally find him. And in those 10 days, thousands and thousands of Soviet citizens and soldiers were killed as the Germans marched. The Germans introduced a blitzkrieg. That was the basic strategy. And there were 3 army groups. There was Army Group North that went towards Leningrad. There was Army Group Center that went towards Moscow. And there was Army Group South that went towards Kiev and the Caucasus in order to grab the oil. What's important about this is they moved quickly, very decisively, overwhelming force. All 3 army groups coming at the Soviets. They didn't just attack on one front. All 3 army groups coming. And had the Russian winter not come early, and had there not been the kind of resistance that was necessary, it's really unclear what would have ended up happening. So on January 20th, we had our own Operation Barbarossa. And people were stunned, even though Project 2025 told us exactly what they were going to do. Exactly. And even the notion of flooding the swamp, right? They told us they were going to do this. And people were sitting back saying, well, not really going to happen. It won't be really that bad. So when the attack started, our movements, labor and other social movements, really didn't know what to do. Because what they did was like the title of that famous film, the award-winning film, Everywhere, what is it? Everywhere, Anything, All at Once, right? Yeah. That's what happened. And one of the difficulties, which I'm going to come back to later, is that those who were prepared to fight really weren't quite sure where to fight because the enemy was attacking us on multiple fronts. And it's like you go after them on the environment, they're coming after workers. You go after them on workers, they're coming after women. You go boom, 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 right? And people were burning out, getting frustrated, really dismayed. There was a failure to understand a number of things. One was that Trump learned a very important lesson from his first term, which is that he needed to have incompetent loyalists working for him who did not have their own minds, that saw themselves as fundamentally loyal to him, not to the Constitution. He didn't need people that would question him. That makes us very different and makes it for a very dangerous situation because of their willingness to continue to violate the Constitution. They also decided that they were going to push as far and as fast as they could and ignore the law and essentially challenge everyone. There were also implied and allegedly explicit threats to Republican members of Congress that if they didn't go with the Blitzkrieg, that they would at a minimum be primary in 2026. And there were also many death threats against various Republicans if they didn't go along with Trump's program. So we're facing a different kind of battlefield. I talked to a number of groups afterwards and talking to them about standing for democracy and fighting back. And the more courageous of them, humble, said, you know, Bill, we really thought it was going to be like 2016, 2017. And we weren't expecting this kind of assault. And you could see that. I appreciated when they said that, but you could see that, particularly in the labor movement. The labor movement has been among the slowest of the movements to respond to the attack and has been responding very inconsistently. And we'll talk some about that in a second, but it's broken down really into 3 sections of the movement. There have been the collaborators, unions that have decided to side with Trump. Then there are the ostriches, those that have decided to bury their heads and possibly their asses and wait out the next 4 years, hoping, praying that they can survive. And then there are the resistors. But even among the resistors, their resistance is inconsistent, and many of them fail to actually say to their members, this is what we're facing. We're actually facing a fascist threat. There is a fascist social movement. Because, see, once upon a time, we were up against just like a Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, or even a George W. Bush. But now we're up against something different. We're up against a movement that represents a third of the population of the country. So we're not just dealing with President Caligula, right? We're not just dealing with President Caligula and Musk, or President Caligula, Musk, and Thiel, right? We're dealing with this strange alliance between these oligarchs and a fascist social movement. And that fascist social movement's intent is to overturn the 20th century and to annihilate us in this room and everyone that we represent. And I'm not using annihilate as a euphemism. So this is what we're dealing with, but many of our leaders are failing to say this to our members. I hear time and again people saying, well, Bill, we have MAGA voters in our ranks. We've got to be careful. We don't want to scare them. We don't want to antagonize them. And I'll talk at the very end about a very different response to this that has a basis in history. But I've said every time I've heard this, that before fascism won in Italy and Nazism in Germany, the trade union movements in both cases were very militant around economic issues, but they refused to be anti-fascist movements. And we see where that got us. So we should learn a few lessons. So what's the framework that we need today on the progressive side? I analogize it to an onion and the skins of an onion. On the outer side, we need to build an anti-fascist consensus. Now, for many of us who have a little bit of sectarianism in us, in our blood, this is going to be really hard. So we're going to have to go through some behavior modification trainings, right? And recognize that in order to defeat the far right, we need to organize the anti-MAGA majority. And the anti-MAGA majority is all over the place politically. I mean, when you have people like Cheney who have been willing to go to break on this, as well as people on the left, I mean, these are all anti-MAGA forces. But for many of us, we think, well, if we have disagreements with these folks, we can't possibly ally with them, even tactically. We have to break with that. We have to understand that when you're going up against a very disciplined enemy that has millions of supporters, you get the supporters you can as quickly as you can, and you get them pointed in the right direction. That's the anti-fascist consensus. And that means that there'll be people that we will disagree with vehemently, people that we know aren't strategic allies. That is, in the long term, we're going in different directions. But in the immediate, the question is, where do you stand on MAGA? And if you stand against MAGA, then you're a friend. And that will be hard for many of us. Now, underneath that skin, there's another skin. And that's the progressive bloc. Those of us that are looking not just to stop MAGA, but we want a different kind of United States. And that core is also very, very important. And therein lies the need to develop a platform, a flag, that we can rally people around in terms of what the future of the United States needs to look like. There have been attempts at this in the past. My mentor, Jack Odell, the late Jack Odell, 20 years ago, drafted something that was called the Democracy Charter, based on what had happened in South Africa in '55 with the South African Freedom Charter. And basically his idea was that we needed to have a discussion among progressives about what it is that we're fighting for. We need something like that, a 10-point program, something very clear that says this is what a post-neoliberal, post-Trump U.S. should look like. And it can't be a book, and we've got to move fast. And so the progressive bloc is important because we need to be thinking about taking power, not waiting until Trump and MAGA are defeated. Right now, just like they're doing in New York City, right? We need to be thinking about putting progressives in, hard-nosed progressives that know how to fight, that will push the weaker elements of the anti-fascist consensus, people that will want to cave. We're not going to let them. We will stand with them and behind them, but we'll stand no further than nose length behind the middle forces. Because we're not going to let them back up. We're not going to let them do what has happened so often in the past, as for example happened in 2009 after Obama was inaugurated. And very quickly, you know, the guy starts backpedaling or attempting to be the adult in the room, as if that was going to convince Mitch McConnell and others to act right. We're not going to let that happen. You know, at that time, and it happened with Clinton as well, and to some extent with Biden, where people were saying, no, you got to give them space, you got to give them time to do things. No, you don't give them a minute of time, because the other side are on them like white on rice. Our job is to keep pushing them and pushing them. That's one of our jobs. The other job is, contrary to what Michelle Obama said, when the other side goes low, we don't go high. We kick them in their face. We kick them in their face. We stomp on them. When they go low, you fight back. This idea of when they go low, we go high. No, that does not convince anyone, because the other side is not interested in compromise. They're not interested in coming to terms with us. They're interested in annihilating us. When you try to come to terms with someone who seeks to annihilate you, you're playing a fool's game. So progressives have to make sure that people don't back up. And then for those of us that are further on the left, we have the job also of building ultimately an anti-capitalist project. For those of us that are on the left, we recognize that capitalism will never bring about the kind of society that we ultimately need. But that doesn't mean that we sit back and say that all this this stuff can play out, and then we'll wait and come forward. No, 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 no. We on the left have to be as committed to building a broad front as Richard was talking about. We have to be the ones that are trying to bring forces together. We have to be the ones that are actively opposing sectarianism. We are the ones that have to keep people focused on opposing the far right. And we are the ones that also have to make sure that provocateurs don't get our supporters to do anything that will be used by the forces of law and disorder in order to destroy us. So we got a heavy job in front of us. Now, one of the things that's been missing since Caligula was inaugurated is the discussion of strategy. There's been a lot of discussion about tactics, and so we've had these wonderful demonstrations. And I'm not being sarcastic. I mean, 7 million people, I mean, and this is like amazing, and everywhere these are happening. But those are tactics, that's not strategy. So I want to talk a little bit about strategy, and then we can go from there. So strategy is not the accumulation of tactics. Strategy begins with an establishment of clear objectives that cover a particular period of time. So for instance, it might be a strategy for 6 months, or 12, or 18, or 3 years, whatever. But it's that particular set of objectives that are clear, concrete, very specific. Not our strategy is to defeat MAGA. That's a goal, right? That's nice, but it's not measurable. So we've got to have clear objectives that we're fighting for. There needs to be coordination. One of the problems that's afflicting us, both within the labor movement as well as outside, is this obsession with brand, right? Everybody wants their own brand. Every organization. It's like, I was talking to someone yesterday who was at a funders briefing, and there's like several funders, and they brought these different organizations together, and each of the organizations was trying to outcompete the other to talk about the great work that they had been doing. And none of them were talking about, wait a minute, time out, right? We're getting our asses kicked, like, what do we do together? So we've got to be thinking about coordination and bring our organizations together, which I am going to ask you when you leave here, in whatever organization you're in, to raise this at the highest levels. We need coordination. You know, I participate in a number of so-called tables, these coalitions, and it strikes me when I'm listening to them, when, you know, one group will say, you know, we had this demonstration, or we did this lawsuit, or we did this, and it's like, okay, that's great, but what are we doing together? And not once did any of these people say, no, what we're proposing X, and anybody that's interested in working with us should join with us to do this. It's all about brand. And we're going to have to break from that fundamentally. We're going to all need to study Sun Tzu and the art of war. And I would argue that any organization that's serious, if your leadership isn't reading Sun Tzu, it's not serious. It's like doing something that's delusional. We need to understand the way this strategy works. And the most important thing that's always repeated from Sun Tzu is know your enemy and know yourself, and you can fight 100 battles without fear of defeat. And what's so important about that is that all too often we do not know our enemy. And we also often don't know ourselves. We don't understand the nature of our enemy. For example, with MAGA. MAGA is a fascist movement, but it is not a monolithic bloc. There are contradictions within MAGA that are very important. For example, the contradictions between Steve Bannon, who parades himself as a kind of pseudo-proletarian fascist, and then you have the Musk people, who are thinking about a kind of world like the science fiction movie Elysium, you know, where the rich are off in space, literally, right? And the rest of us are here in misery. I mean, they're very different visions that exist within MAGA. They're the Christian nationalists and the secular fascists. You have all kinds of forces, but they are at this moment united. Now, how long will they be united? And are there fissures that we can play with? For example, the Epstein situation is driving Trump crazy, which is why he's trying to do everything, you know, preparing for war with Venezuela, everything else. You know, I'm surprised he's not talking about how the Romulans are getting ready to attack the Earth, right? I mean, he wants to do everything in order to keep our minds off of Epstein. But within the MAGA ranks, interestingly, a lot of MAGA folks are really concerned about that. What can we play on that? So these are some of the things we got to think about. We have to be aware that we're in an asymmetric battle, that our opponent is much stronger than us, much better funded, but that's not a surprise, because the oppressor is always better funded, right? And usually better organized. So what we have to figure out is, what are the strengths that we have, and how can we fight the other side using alternative strategic thinking as well as tactical thinking. So what the other side would like us to do is to confront them head on. Much like the British wanted the colonial rebels to confront them. You know, the British were walking through the woods in nice red coats, right? Mm-hmm. And the colonial folks were saying, we're not going to put on red, we're going to be looking like bushes, and we're going to blow your head off, right? And it was asymmetric, because the British, for a variety of reasons, should have won, and they didn't. And we've got to be keeping in mind that we are in an asymmetric fight. And that's okay. It shouldn't be the source of depression or despair. It's just dealing with reality. We're dealing with the long game. And our tactics need to, this will ring for all organizers. Our tactics should escalate, not stupidly escalate. They should escalate both in terms of drawing in people, more people, who have come to the conclusion that further tactics and stronger tactics need to be implemented, but also greater pressure on our opponents. So for instance, we don't need any more weekend demonstrations. No, we don't. We need moratoriums. So for those of you that are old enough to remember the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement, we had moratoriums. Now, there's people that run around saying we have to have a general strike. And, you know, that's really good, except there's no one who's active now who grew up in the United States that ever went through a general strike. Ever. Because the last general strike was in 1946. So it's like you can, in the United States, so you can talk all you want about general strikes, but it's just rhetoric. But moratoriums are real. In the Vietnam War, there were several moratoriums, and these were what in South Africa they call stayaways. They were in effect general strikes, but no one called it a general strike. It's just that people didn't go to work, didn't go to school, didn't buy items. Things shut down. So and it was during the week. It wasn't on weekends. We need to increase the pressure. And when we do this, we're ready now. After Saturday, I'm convinced we're ready to move towards moratoriums. People want to do more because it's clear that Caligula is trying to stand firm. We need to up the pressure. And so it's a long game. And then, as I mentioned, we need a platform that centers the defense of democracy and extending democracy. Just a little caveat about that. There's many people that have said things, I hear this all the time, we're not about reestablishing the status quo. And that's true. But we should be about defending the things that have been won over the last 100+ years. Right? You know, voting rights, the EPA, women's right to vote. Women's right to vote. You have a section of the Republican Party that's saying women should no longer have the right to vote. I mean, things that I would never have believed possible that someone could be articulating. So we should be defending things that we won, but also going farther and saying we need more. All right, so what are the implications from this? A few things. One, resistance takes time to build. We in the United States are incredibly impatient. But one of the things that I've noticed about the aftermath of coups and invasions is that it usually seems to take about a year for the resistance to coalesce for a variety of reasons. And that unless, and there are certain exceptions, when people have been fully prepared for an invasion or fully prepared for a coup, as they were in Venezuela in 2002, or in South Korea very recently. In the United States, we've been asleep at the switch. So we weren't prepared. So it takes time, and we have to understand that there needs to be patience, but not lethargy, right? Patience as we build. And it's going to take time for things to coalesce. The fact that 7 million people showed up on Saturday and Trump didn't immediately resign should not affect us. But what is more important for us to understand about our enemy is that the fact that Trump indicated that he wanted, $200 million from DOJ, that corruption did not destroy MAGA, that you didn't have MAGA members running away from him in droves saying, what the, right? Tells us that he has a core of people that are wrapped up in irrationalism. They are completely devoted to him. They're not just fringe people, they are completely devoted to him. And that tells us some very important things about our enemy. All right. What do we need to do? A few things. We need to demand that our national organizations converge, we put aside brand, and we develop a collective strategy. I have talked to a number of national unions about standing for democracy. I'm not going to name them because I don't want to embarrass anyone. I don't want someone coming up to me later saying that I somehow humiliated them by mentioning the name of their union. But what I will say is the response has been less than exciting. I'll give you an example. One big union said to me that, well, we agree with everything that you're saying, but we're not going to support you. Now, I read that like 3 times, and I said, like, what am I missing? So I contacted their political director. I said, you support us, but you're not, well, you got to understand, this was like early in the year. He said, well, we got to figure out how we're using our money and blah, 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 blah. And, I said, look, you got a big union. If you want to do what we're trying to do with Standing for Democracy, because we started with a couple of local unions and one national union. So if you want to do what we're doing, please do it, and we will dissolve into you. They didn't expect to hear that. They got very silent, and then ultimately ghosted me. Another national union also agreed on what we're trying to do, but then said, but as I mentioned before, we got all these MAGA voters, and what we need to do is build solidarity within our ranks, and that's going to stop the fascists. I said, it didn't happen. It didn't help in Germany. Right? So, I don't know what you're talking about. And building solidarity around what? Wages, hours, and working conditions? Fascists can unite on that. Ask people who've done organizing in the South, where there's KKK members who are active trade unionists. No. That's a different kind of solidarity. If you mean, let's talk about solidarity against the LGBT folks who are being threatened. Is that what you're talking about? Are you talking about solidarity against the new SS, otherwise known as ICE? Is that what you're talking about? What solidarity are you talking about? Don't bullshit me, right? Let's talk real about how we're going to stop this. And then they ghosted me. I've been seeing a lot of ghosts recently. So, your mission, should you decide to accept it, is that you go to any organization that you're in and you ask them, what are we doing to stop the fascists? And what organizations are we aligning with in order to stop them? What coalitions are we building at the local, state, or national levels? What are we doing? And don't tell me that, we're working together and we're going to stop these attacks. No. We got 1/3 of the population against us. So what are we doing? So that's your mission. Third thing. At the level of strategy, since we're in an asymmetric battle, war, got to think very differently. Any of you in the military might be familiar with this term. It's called theaters of operation. And so, for example, in World War II, there was the European theater of operation. There was also a Mediterranean theater of operation. There was a Pacific theater of operation. And each of these theaters of operation had specific enemies that they were fighting. They had a particular structure that they were working with in order to overcome that enemy. So if you were in a European theater of operation, you weren't focused on what Douglas MacArthur was doing in the Pacific. You were focusing on what is going on in Europe. We need theaters of operation. And this is the way we will stop the blitzkrieg. We need to have theaters of operation that are based around specific things, like we need to have an environmental theater of operation. We need to have a workers' rights theater of operation. We need to have a history theaters of operation. Because the right is attacking history. They're attacking through the attack on DEI, the attack on the Smithsonian, the attack on the National Park Service. It's an attack on history, and we need to be engaged in that. And that means that we can't do everything. But what we can do is when we have these theaters of operation, different organizations can take the lead in those specific theaters and develop defensive and offensive strategies for us to follow. One of the things that does is it helps us break from despair, and also helps us break from the idea that we have to accomplish everything, which we can't. So for instance, when the fires took place in Southern California, Trump and the Republicans in Congress mocked Karen Bass, right? And they mocked Newsom. And they said, if California wants help in the aftermath of the fires, they're gonna have to make all these concessions. You might remember this. So I contacted some environmental groups and I said, so okay, so what are we gonna do? And said, well, you know, we're doing this in Washington. I know this is being recorded, but I'm just gonna say, I use the F word. F Washington. What are we doing in each state? Why aren't we putting pressure on every congressional representative in every state saying that California gets unconditional support in rebuilding? Further, that the southeast part of the United States that was racked by the Hurricane Helene gets unconditional support in rebuilding. And what I got back was silence. I'm telling you, I keep running into ghosts. Silence. As if that was some brilliant idea. It wasn't any brilliant idea, but it was what we needed to do. An environmental theater of operation would be thinking about how do we fight the right in the environment or around the environment, because the far right has no solution to the environmental catastrophe outside of genocide. That is their solution. We have the opportunity to counter them. So we need to develop these theaters of operation. We need to develop legal teams and defense funds. Desperately. I have a friend who was despairing because she felt like there was nothing she could do that made any difference. But then she told me the story about how ICE had grabbed a friend of hers and disappeared the person, and that she and some other people were able to get this person somehow released. And I said, that's fantastic. She said, oh, Bill, you know, I didn't accomplish much. I said, no, you did something really important. I said, now what you need to do is to identify others that can be part of legal teams, because there's going to be more of this. We have to have them in every city, legal teams, legal defense funds, because they're not stopping with immigrants. And even if they were, right, we need those legal teams. So that's an additional piece. And labor could be very important there. We need educational programs to understand the enemy. There's a number, Standing for Democracy has an educational curriculum that is available to organizations. There are other curricula that are out there circulating. And one of the things that we try to do is explain the historical roots of the current MAGA. But there are others that trainings on non-cooperation and other things. These are all very important. We've got to talk with our members about what's going on. A real heart-to-heart about what's at stake. And that, I'll give you an example. This guy, a friend of mine, came back from the Atlanta Central Labor Council, a meeting a few weeks ago, and he said, Bill, one of the leaders said, well, you know, our members aren't really mobilizing around this because they don't feel like what Trump is doing has any real effect on them. I said, what? Are you kidding? I mean, Medicare, Medicaid, the environment, the end of the NLRB, that has no impact on them? And I would say it's not that the members are stupid, it's the leadership is stupid and cowardly. That the leadership should be out there talking with the members, as we have seen in the Painters Union, which is one of the unions where the president is really out there talking with the members, right? But we have too many leaders that I would argue are cowardly. They're sitting back and they're really hoping and praying that this thing is going to boil over, right? But no, you've got to talk with the members, and education and having the leaders out there saying, no, we are at battle stations. This becomes critical. We need creative protests. This is on the tactical level. And there's been some examples of this that are very important, like in Portland. These people in these weird outfits that have been showing up. This is marvelous, right? And the ICE folks don't know what to do. The National Guard people aren't going to mess with them, but the ICE folks just don't know what to do. And it reminded me of a story I told last night about a few years ago. There was this fascist rally in Pittsburgh, and so these left-wing clowns showed up, and I don't mean clowns euphemistically, they were clowns. And they showed up and they brought along like all this flour. And so every time the fascists would say white power, they would throw the flour out and they'd say, oh, white flour, right? And it would get all over the fascists, right? And the next time they'd say white power, then they'd throw the flour on them again and say white powder, right? And the fascists just became completely discombobulated, right? And the whole thing broke up. We've got to introduce humor. And this led me to conclude that one of the things that we need to do is have a national laughing. And soon, before it gets too cold. And I don't mean like Rowan and Martin's laughing for those of you that are my age, around my age. I mean like just as there are teachings, we should have laugh-ins. And I don't mean just like having D.L. Hughley show up, right? It'd be great if he did, and it'd be great if George Carlin was still with us, right? But no, I mean at all different levels. So maybe you have something at the LA Coliseum, but you might also have something at a library here in Rochester, where regular people get together, and these would be laugh-ins for the First Amendment, and it'd be opportunities to mock Trump. Now, mocking Trump is very important because this guy loves to insult people, but has such a weak ego. You gotta wonder what his childhood was like, right? I mean, really, he really can't take it when people mock him. What did I say about weaknesses? Play on your opponent's weaknesses. Get them to do stupid things that they weren't planning on doing. National laugh-ins. Make the point. Let's celebrate the Jimmy Kimmel victory. Let's talk about the First Amendment and talk about a lot of other fun things. We have to engage in self-defense. Because this is being recorded, and because I don't know who is in the room, all I will say is self-defense. And I'm serious. All levels of self-defense. The other side does not just use harsh language. They're very well armed. And they want to provoke a war. We have to be prepared to defend ourselves in different ways. We have to be prepared to defend ourselves against provocateurs. We have to defend ourselves against people that may come and try to assault us. We have to do whatever we have to do. The labor movement has a long history in this, which we often don't want to talk about. But the labor movement knows a little bit about self-defense. All organizations need to be thinking about this because the other side is trying to push us in a way. We need to put demands on government. That includes, arresting ICE. One of my favorite examples is something that happened in LA where tow trucks were brought out to tow ICE vehicles away. And because these ICE vehicles were unmarked, they could be towed. Yep. And so the ICE, these SS would go off and then they come back and there was no vehicle for them. Oh, surprise, surprise, right? So there's things that we can demand of government that becomes critically important, as well as making sure that local police do not mess with us when we're engaged in protests. We need to be doing electoral work, as I said, we need to be fighting for power. And a final couple of things. We need to treat ICE and troops differently. This is very, very important. Very important. ICE is becoming our SS. Right? They are They are a combination of SS and mercenaries, and they are sick. The use of those masks is not to protect them. The use of those masks is to intimidate us, but also give them the courage to brutalize us. These are sick puppies, and they're not going to be won over. I mean, somebody asked me the other night, you know, are they going to defect? I don't think that they will. Now, National Guard and enlisted personnel are very different and should not be treated as the enemy. In many cases, as we see already, National Guard are deployed, and they're like walking around like, what the hell are we doing here? Like, what, I'm shoveling dirt? I mean, what, literally, right? We need to make sure that they are not treated as the enemy. Focus our attention on ICE. And there's some really excellent examples around the country where people have literally chased ICE out of communities. Large numbers, bullhorns, everything else. This becomes very, very important. And I mentioned the program. Now, the final point is about courage and leadership. And this is addressed particularly to members of unions. A friend of mine named Tej Nagaraja is writing this book about the U.S. in World War II, the domestic front. And he asked me to read a chapter. And this was about a year ago. And it was about the hate strikes during World War II. How many of you are familiar with the hate strikes in World War II? Okay, so let me tell you about that. And this is why the fight around history becomes so important. So in 1941, the U.S. is building up for the war, knowing inevitably the U.S. is going to get it. But all these factories are starting to produce equipment. So this is helping to end the Depression. But black workers weren't being hired. So A. Philip Randolph, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, comes up with this idea and basically goes to Roosevelt and says, we need you to sign an executive order opening up the military production to black workers. And Roosevelt explains to him why that's impossible because of the political situation and how difficult everything was. And Randolph, being very diplomatic, said, fine, there'll be 10,000 black folks that are going to march on Washington to protest you. Well, Roosevelt got very nervous. Now, 10,000 today doesn't sound like a lot, but in 1941, as the war is approaching, you didn't need 10,000 black folks marching through Washington, D.C. So he tries everything to discourage his march. And he sends his wife, Eleanor, to go talk with Randolph and to appeal to him. And Randolph was reportedly very gentlemanly, very diplomatic, thanked her, and said, now there's going to be 100,000 black folks that are going to march on Washington. And at that point, Roosevelt blinked and signed a very famous executive order opening up military production to black workers, a major breakthrough. Problem was, immediately and through the course of the war, there were wildcat hate strikes that were carried out by white racists to prevent the hiring of black workers. Now I want you to think about this. It was not clear until Midway and then certainly Stalingrad that the Axis powers were going to lose. Nevertheless, these racists were prepared to stop military production in order to keep black workers out. And they did, all over the country. But most trade union leaders stood against them. Think about that. They stood against their own members who were engaged in these racist wildcats. They said to their own members, I don't care whether you're a member. We're standing against you. We're not going to support these strikes. We're not going to sit on the side being silent either. We're not going to play neutral. We are in opposition to these hate strikes. That's the kind of leadership we need right now. We need leaders in our different movements, and particularly in labor, that are prepared to say, yes, there may be MAGA members in our ranks, and you know what? We'll continue to represent them on wages, hours, and working conditions. But hell if you think we're going to remain silent about fascism. Hell if you think we're going to say that your views, about women, about gays and lesbians, about immigrants, is an acceptable view in our organization. We will represent you. We'll represent you when you have a grievance around a wage or something else. But we're not going to tolerate and say that in any way your views on what's happening in this country are acceptable. That's the kind of leadership we need. And with that kind of leadership, the trade union movement and elsewhere, we will decisively defeat MAGA and have the opportunity to create a different country. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. So we've got time. How much time, Colin, do we have?
40-ish minutes?
Okay, good.